This is my E36, my drift car. I've been drifting this car for 3 seasons now. However, all this time she was a little underpowered. The M50B30 that's currently inside is good enough to learn the basics, but I'm yearning for some additional power. And so this season, it was finally time to do the engine swap. So what am I swapping in, you might be asking? This engine right here is a BMW M54B30. It's a 3-liter, 6-cylinder with 24 valves and double the vanos of the previous engine. It produces a crisp 231 horsepower, which is more than enough. But why did I decide to go with this engine in particular? There are a couple of reasons. First, it's relatively cheap. For my unit here, I paid just a little over 1,000 euros. Also, it's relatively easy to swap this engine into an E36. It basically directly bolts in place. There's a little bit more work with wiring and such than an M50 or an M52 swap. Before we begin, let me just say that this series is not meant as a guide, but my personal journey through the swap. It's also my first time doing this sort of thing, so this may not be the most optimal way of doing it. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. First of all, I needed to put the engine on a stand, so I could comfortably work on it. Next, I wanted to clean the engine. I needed to cover up all electrical connectors, the alternator, plug up the hoses and block off the exhaust ports. Some old socks in the exhaust ports, plastic bags, paper towels, duct tape and some PVC bags for the connectors should do the job, right? Right?
No.
To clean the engine, I was using some degreaser, a brush and a hose. To be honest, it really wasn't working that well. But then I heard, listen kiddo, this is how you do it. It was my granddad. He sprayed the engine down with some special industrial degreaser and power washed the sucker down. And man, I gotta say, this stuff is really awesome. It got rid of all of the oily residue and grime. I'm gonna try and find it and list it in the description. Although this rather aggressive approach did lead to some less than desirable results. Well, I hope it'll still work. I did dry them off with compressed air immediately afterwards. Next up, I had to tackle the oil sump. Some of you have probably noticed by now that this particular engine has holes for front axles in the sump. That's because this engine came from a 330 Xi, the 4-wheel drive E36 model, which meant that I had to replace the oil sump and with it the dipstick and the pickup for the oil pump from a regular E46. E39 sump is a little bit different, but it may work as well. I got those parts, washed them, cleaned them up and got rid of the rest of the gasket on the sump, so everything was ready to be installed. I also let the oil out of the engine. I let it drip overnight because it was still cold outside and I wanted to really empty it as much as possible.
Yeah, unbolt this bastard. Yeah, I'm doing it. Oh, it's on there. Now if I don't fuck this up, I won't get anything on my hands. Oh, that's dense. Oh, holy shit, that's the densest oil I've ever seen.
And since I was already taking the sump off, I was advised to check the rod bearings just to see what kind of state they were in. So we checked them over with my dad. But before that, I had to get this heavy bitch of an oil sump off. Just a pro tip, to get it off, you first need to remove the power steering pump and get it out the way. I knew that, of course. This is just some footage I found on YouTube. Poor guy, look at him struggling. I feel bad for him. I really do.
Come on. Why are you the way that you are? Oh, that's a heavy bitch.
When I eventually got the sump off, I noticed something weird. There were these little pieces of plastic in the sump, and also the oil pickup was full of them. I asked my friends what this might be. They told me they might be pieces of the valve cover gasket between the spark plug chambers that hardened, crumbled and fell into the engine. Okay, so no worries. I'll just turn the engine around, pick the pieces out and we'll be golden. But then this happened.
O kurwa. Drž od verige. Drž od verige.
So yeah, it wasn't gonna be that simple. One of the timing chain guides exploded and needed to be replaced, which meant that the job got a little bit bigger. But we'll deal with that later. We first need to check the bearings.
A to se zmerno isto pogleda ali to samo naključne?
Veš kako, odmeri se pogleda bolj tega ta šestega, no če bi še šestega, bi bilo še boljša, ker bi smo najmanj mazanja, samo tudi peti ne bo, če bo peti dober, bo tudi šesti dober. Vole. Avto ima popravno tole not. Načeloma to bi bilo kar za zamenjati, veš. Veš, ko se sveti, ne?
Ja.
Bi že malo manjka, a ne, je že malo zrabljena, ne? Ponavadi, ko so zdaj so celi sve svete, ne? To je zgornji, te spodnji je pa vedno je tako, ne? Spodnji pa ni okrepljen, je pa čisto dobro, ne?
They weren't that bad, but we decided to replace them anyway, just to be safe. So next up I removed the oil pump and we replaced the bearings.
Ponavadi je najbolj zrabljen vedeti zadnji, ne? Tole. Tu ta je vredi.
Če se vidi, ja,
Ta je že bolj obrabljena, ne? Ali ta je že zrabljen do tle, skoraj do polovice in še na tej strani se pozna, ne? Tako da tle menjava ležavi kar dobra pravilna odločitev. Tukaj pritisneš dol. In pa tu nastaviš kot, ne. Psovnice. Je zelo pomembno, mislim pomembno, ne samo pomembno, edino prav je, edino samo, da Bog ne da bencinčke med sabo zamenjati, ne. Vsak je samo od svoje ovnice in samo na svoje mesto. Zato vedno razdirati, moraš na to biti zelo pozoren, ne.
I decided to do one more thing. A common problem with these engines is the oil pump, specifically the oil pump shaft failure. And trust me, you don't want to lose pressure while mid-run. Let me set the scene for you. You just did an amazing run. Perfect line, hard on power, limiter bouncing all the way, all that fun stuff. You end the run, you take a look at the gauges to check the temps, and you see this. Yeah, we're gonna have a problem. So to avoid that, I'm getting an oil pump reinforcement kit from SKIDSHOP. Link to where you can get this kit for yourself is in the description. It's pretty easy to install. First you need to get the pump off the engine. Just watch out because this main nut is left-hand thread. Oh, scratch that. You probably don't need to remove it, I just happen to have it off. You just need to get the gear and the front plate off. Then you disassemble the pump, you press the old shaft out of the inner rotor and press the new one in. Do be careful to measure how far you need to press the new shaft in, as you want your chain to be running straight. Also, it's recommended to pop the shaft in the freezer beforehand, so you have an easier time pressing it in. After that, you just reassemble the pump and put it back on the engine. We also put some Loctite on the main nut to make sure it doesn't come off. And that was that. Now I had to fix the whole chain guide situation. My plan was to tear the engine down as little as possible. Since the engine doesn't have a flywheel, locking the bottom end would be quite troublesome. I decided to first take the front cover off and go from there. I started by taking off the viscous fan, the valve cover and the water pump pulley. While I was at it, I removed the AC compressor, as I wasn't gonna need it. I also took off the thermostat housing. But before I could continue, I had to remove the valve unit. And for that, I needed to lock the camshafts in place. The tool I used was once again provided by SKIDSHOP, and the link is once again in the description. I got to work removing the valves.
Yeah, boy.
Then with some help from my dad, we removed the Jesus bolt and the vibration damper. When we took it off, it was apparent that the front main seal was bad, and I decided to replace that too. Now the only thing to do was hammer out the studs on both sides of the cover and unbolt it. I had to hold this bolt that comes in from the head because I couldn't get it out completely. And at first I forgot to unbolt one of the upper bolts that also holds the upper chain guide. But after that was taken care of, the cover came off no problem, and it revealed what was hiding underneath. The guide that fell apart was the right one, and what was left were only a couple of pieces. Apparently this happened some time ago, because the studs that hold the guide in place were ground down by the chain, so they had to be replaced as well. I quickly ordered the parts from BMW. I also ordered the left guide, the tensioner actually. My logic was that if the right one failed, the left one might as well. The parts came in and I was gonna put everything back together. I took the studs off and here you can see how fucked they actually were. It looked like replacing the guide was gonna be a pain in my ass if I wasn't gonna remove the whole chain. I also had to be careful not to mess up the timing. But when I put just a little tension on the chain, a piece of the upper chain guide broke. Great, here we go again. These plastic bits are really brittle after all this time. When I was removing the old left guide, it has a little clip that holds it on the stud. I just touched it with a screwdriver and broke the fucker off immediately.
Oh, that broke. Yeah, this is crumbly and old.
So no more fucking around. I ordered the upper guide and my dad advised me to replace the chains as well as the lower sprocket since they seemed a bit off. So I ordered those too. In the meantime, I took off the intake manifold as I had to replace a plastic coolant hose that goes into the water pump on the front cover. The tip of it broke off in the hole. I also cleaned up and prepared the surfaces for the gaskets for when everything is put back together. I ended up with a pretty impressive pile of parts. And the disassembled engine. Tear the engine down as little as possible. Since I wasn't gonna risk messing up the timing, my dad once again helped me to replace the chains. We had to be careful though, because the bottom end wasn't locked, so turning the crankshaft would be a big no-no. Yo, by the way, remember when I said that these plastics were brittle? Check out what happened when I unbolted the upper chain guide.
Kurvati. Amit samo, che uredo je sei.
Because these engines have a super duper fancy VVT system, known to BMW people as Vanos, we needed a special tool to install the upper chain and to align the hydraulic actuators in the right position. I got the tool off AliExpress for like 50 euros and it worked fine. We also installed the front main seal and put the chain cover back on. Next up, I reinstalled the replacement coolant hose that I mentioned earlier, but it was quite difficult to get it in, so I had to remove another hose. And guess what? This one broke as well. At this point, I'm not even surprised anymore.
Extend my sentence.
I had to order a new one. I cleaned up the remaining pieces and look at this. They're brown. They got so old and corroded they changed color from black to brown. Because of that, I couldn't yet install the intake manifold, so I focused on installing the valve cover and the oil pan. First off, I had to reinstall the Vanos unit, but I wanted to clean it up just a little bit because it was really gunky. It doesn't seem like they replace the oil frequently enough in this engine. Then I installed it with a gasket. When I was tightening the left hand thread bolts in the unit, my torque wrench wouldn't click. They were supposed to be tightened to only like 10 Newton meters, but as I was tightening them, it felt like I already went past that point. Maybe my torque wrench just didn't work for left-hand threads, and I didn't want to risk it, since there were only M6 bolts. I ended up manually tightening it up to what it felt like 10 Newton meters, and we'll see what happens.
Fuck this.
Next up, I installed the thermostat housing and the water pump pulley. Then it was time for the valve cover. I cleaned up the surface and removed any residue of the old gasket. I then applied some sealant on the edges and the half moons, like you're supposed to. I popped the valve cover on and carefully tightened it. Oh, and I almost remembered to install the intake cam baffle before the valve cover.
Okay. Se veš kaj pravijo? Oops.
I had to repeat the whole process, but this time everything was fine. With the valve cover back on, I replaced the spark plugs and put the coils back in. Then I replaced that hose that broke earlier. I turned the engine around to finally close it completely by installing the oil pan. First, I had to put the oil pickup back on the pump. And here I ran into a bit of a problem. It looked like the oil pickup didn't fit on the oil deflector. The mounting points were a little bit different. My dad suggested that we should just measure the height of the pickup and then drill new holes to make it fit. But I wasn't so sure, and to be safe I opted to find another pickup. The only thing I could get my hands on was a pickup out of an E39, so I bought the sump as well. I cleaned up the parts and prepared them for the install. I also got some replacement bolts for the sump because some of the 330XI ones were a bit too long. Then I installed the sump. Unfortunately, one of the bolts was a little too short, because I really wanted them to all be 10mm, and so I stripped a little bit of the thread. So I put a longer bolt in its place. Unfortunately, this time it was a Torx bolt. I tightened it to spec and we'll see what happens. If it leaks, I'm just gonna have to tap in a bigger thread. And another thing that I did as a preventative measure was replace the plastic hose that goes from the breather in the valve cover to the CCV. I was told that the plastic hose often breaks and it's a lot harder to replace it once the intake manifold is on the engine. I wanted to replace the plastic with the rubber coolant hose I had lying around, but it turns out that I didn't have any in the correct size. So I used this. Yeah, it's a little overkill, but it'll do the job. And like every engine builder knows, blue hoses and red fittings add horsepower, so it's not all that bad. And with all that sorted, I put the intake manifold back on. I then replaced the O-ring on the DISA valve. The last thing I did was replacing some of the old vacuum hoses. I also replaced the vacuum caps on the side of the manifold. Since I didn't have the replacement plugs, I just cut up some hose and blocked it on one side with some gasket maker and a bolt. Again, we'll see what happens. But that is pretty much it for this time. I'm gonna need to get the power steering pump off the old engine and put it on this one. I'm also gonna get an exhaust manifold, and I also need to sort out the wiring.
The problem when you're swapping into an E36, don't mind the invisible strut bar. The ECU on E36s is here, but on E46s it's on this side. So the problem is that the whole wiring harness is too short. I have two options: either make it longer, to make each individual cable longer, or get an E39 wiring harness that is long enough and reaches to there.
But more on that in the next video. If you by any chance did a swap like this or similar to this and have some tips for me, I'd be very grateful if you could drop them down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like if you wanna, but you don't have to. I won't force ya. But that's it. See you in the next one. Bye!